Welcome everyone, and welcome to our online participants. I'm Anna Triandafiliou, and I hold the chair in the CERC Migration. I think I will not introduce very much myself. I'm very excited to have this book launch here of one of our colleagues, Younès Ahouga. Before I start, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. We're gathering here today in Toronto. That is the Dish with One Spoon territory, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga tribes. But it is also, I mean, we take part. We acknowledge the beautiful message that is written in the symbolism of the dish with one spoon. The idea that we all share in the natural resources of these places. We are all invited to share them in peace. And to take care of them as they have been given to us from past generations that live in the land, particularly the indigenous people since time immemorial, but also for us and for the future generations. And I think at the time of global warming, this kind of heeding this call is all the most important and timely. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that I am also a settler. I came to Canada 5 years ago, and I was an uninvited guest. And as a migration scholar, I feel there are some tensions between what we try to achieve in Canada in terms of truth and reconciliation, and what, you know, as a migration scholar, I'm struggling kind of, you know, the fighting borders and, you know, ethnocultural nationalism. So, but we all have to work together in this in Canada, and I think that's what we try to do. Without further ado, I want to welcome, you know, the two people that we have here today. Younès, that is going to present briefly his book. It's the book is based on his PhD, and it's been a long time coming. The book is in French, and it is published by the University of Ottawa Press, but we decided to have the talk in English, so as actually to give an opportunity for people who don't read French to hear what the book is about. Delighted to have Thomas Lacroix, who is here as a scholar of excellence and professor in Sciences Po, to comment on the book. He's also an expert on these issues of global governance. So we are delighted to have him, and I'm very happy to have Emma Brouillard as our co-chair, taking questions from our online participants. So as you can see, the panel was designed to be a French-speaking panel, but I think it is a bilingual panel, and naturally, if anyone online or in person wants to ask a question in French, you're very welcome to do so. So at least we can pay a little tribute to bilingualism in Canada. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Younès.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the launch of my book titled Gouverner les migrations pour perpétuer la mondialisation. Gestion, migratoire et organisation internationale pour les migrations, which translates roughly to governing migration to perpetuate globalization, migration management, and international organization for migration. Before I begin talking about the book, I would like to thank Anna for her support, which allowed me to write and publish the book. Also thank Thomas for kindly accepting to discuss the book, and I'd like also to thank Laura and Grace for their work promoting this event. So what is the book about? I discovered that summarizing a book is a more difficult task than it seems at first, even when one has written the book. I struggled for a while to find a proper way to introduce the International Organization for Migration to an audience that might have heard about it, read about it, even used its definitions and data, but have not spent years doing research on it as I did. And the best way I found to start my talk is to show you this quote taken from the 2003 World Migration Report, which is the flagship annual report of IOM. And the quote goes as follows. One thing is beyond doubt. Migration is gradually eroding the traditional boundaries between languages, cultures, ethnic groups, and nation states. A transnational flow par excellence, it therefore defies cultural traditions, national identities, and political institutions, contributing in the long run to curtailing nation-state autonomy and to shaping a global society. So the quote illustrates three aspects of IOM that the book focuses on. First, the quote is illustrative of an organization that seeks to dispel doubts about migration by offering an authoritative interpretation of what migration is and will be. Accordingly, one of the objectives of the book is to critically analyze how IOM discursively reduces the complexity of migration to frame the interpretations, actions, and experiences of a number of social actors in migration governance. Second, the quote implicitly informs us of how IOM views its role, its mission in migration governance. It sees itself as one of the custodians of the process of emergence of a global society. Its role is to ensure that the cultures, identities, political institutions, and borders of the nation state do not hinder the transnational flows of globalization. One of the contributions of the book is therefore to shed light on the ways that IOM seeks to regulate the exercise of state sovereignty, despite lacking the authority to do so and despite depending on states for its funding. The book also argues that IOM interventions to solve humanitarian and migration crisis, which came to account for the largest part of the organization's budget, how these interventions are best understood in the context of this quote. Through these interventions, IOM aims to ensure that crises at the periphery of globalization do not undermine the emergence of a global society, notably by reinforcing the tendency of the nation state to protect its borders when faced with crisis. Third, this quote is interesting because it comes from a part of IOM that researchers often overlook in favor of IOM country offices. The 2003 World Migration Report is authored by the Migration Policy and Research Program. This program, which changed names multiple times over the years, is a crucial component of the IOM administration located in Geneva, Switzerland. The role of the program consists in developing a global comprehension of migration that is different from how states view migration. Its role is to determine the policy and organizational priorities of IOM, and its role consists to lead interactions between IOM on the one hand and states, international organizations, NGOs, and academics on the other. In this regard, another contribution of the book is to illustrate how IOM staff, diplomats, and experts negotiated the discourses, priorities, and organizational practices of IOM from Geneva. So based on this initial discussion of the quote, I would summarize the book by saying that it is about how the IOM shapes migration governance by offering a particular interpretation of migration, by designing technocratic interventions to realize said interpretation, and by deriving authority from the pursuit of the seemingly desirable social goal of safeguarding globalization. However, summarizing the book is not enough. To encourage you to read it, I need to explain why it is important to study IOM and why I spent years doing so. First, the book fills a knowledge gap about IOM. The organization is understudied in comparison to the UNHCR. My book is only the fourth book that focuses on IOM. This is despite the growing influence of IOM on migration governance. The organization was founded in 1951 by 16 Western governments as an alternative to the UNHCR and ILO, which were suspected of favoring communism and communist countries. That's why for the longest time, IOM was outside the UN. For most of its history, IOM's role was limited to transporting refugees from Europe to North America, South Africa, and Australia. However, in 1989, IOM became a permanent organization, tasked additionally with producing knowledge about migration and offering a forum for states to discuss international cooperation. During the 1990s, IOM became actively involved in the fight against irregular migration on behalf of European governments. The organization changed once more between the 2000s and 2018, which is the period considered by the book. IOM progressively increased its membership to non-Western states. It expanded its budget and the scope of its activities to include so-called emergency and post-emergency interventions in the aftermath of a humanitarian and migration crisis. IOM also joined the UN as a related organization in 2016 and took part in the negotiations of the Global Compact for Migration in 2017 and 2018. In other words, IOM has to be scrutinized as it plays a crucial role in migration governance, not only in operational terms, but also in policy terms. One way to understand the role of IOM in migration governance is by considering the imaginary of migration management. An imaginary organizes discourses, ways of acting and interacting, and ways of being that frame the interpretations, interactions, and experiences of social actors. Migration management was first developed in 1993 by Bimal Ghosh, a professor of public administration, and he developed migration management during the work of the Commission on Global Governance. The Commission was an informal forum of international officials that argued for the need of global institutions to govern the interdependencies of globalization. Accordingly, Ghosh designed migration management as an alternative to the securitization of migration, which he believed states pursued in ineffective and counterproductive ways. And one of his main criticisms of states is that by trying to protect their borders, states incentivize individuals to use irregular channels of migration. Migration management argued for the regulated openness of borders and for creating legal channels for migration to improve the allocation of human resources for the global economy. So migration management differs in one crucial aspect from the alternative securitization and liberalization of migration. It is not concerned with protecting or fulfilling legal principles, such as the sovereignty of states or the right of individuals to leave their country of origin. Rather, it aims to establish the efficient technical coordination and optimization of migration governance to manage the economic and political pressures inherent to globalization and the intensification of migration. However, migration governance is fragmented between competing and contradictory discourses, norms, and institutions. In the absence of an international migration regime that would impose migration management, the latter has to be promoted and implemented by real institutions in order to affect real change. And Bimal Ghosh found such an institution in the IOM. Between 1997 and 2001, Ghosh led a research project which involved IOM, and the research project proposed a migration management as a new multilateral approach to migration governance. And this approach argued for the establishment of a set of shared policy objectives between states. It argued for the development of an agreed and internationally harmonized normative framework to ensure coherence across the multiple levels of migration governance. And it required the setting up of a mechanism that would monitor the policies of states, migration policies of states. After the end of the project, IOM created the Migration Policy and Research Program, which I mentioned earlier, with the task of transforming IOM into the main proponent and implementer of migration management. And the book examines how from this point on, IOM developed, implemented, and promoted migration management, both within the organization and outside the organization, until 2018, when the Global Compact was adopted. That being said, the question remains as to why IOM adopted migration management. The main argument of the book is that IOM adopted migration management in a bid to act as a counterweight to states in migration governance. The IOM found in migration management a coherent doctrine that can be used to reshape how states understand their interests when it comes to migration. A doctrine that can be used to expand IOM activities outside, beyond the fight against irregular migration, which was favored by donor states. And it's a doctrine that could be used to overcome the antagonisms in migration governance between countries of destination and countries of origin, antagonisms which created a barrier for international cooperation. IOM also adopted migration management to become part of the project of global managerialism. This project, identified by the political scientist Jonathan Murphy, is led by a transnational coalition of governments, international organizations, multinational corporations, and think tanks that aim to solve the financial, economic, humanitarian crisis facing globalization through technical means. The book reveals many instances where IOM leveraged the discursive financial and technical resources offered by global managerialism to increase its authority and autonomy vis-à-vis states. The argument that IOM acts as a counterweight to states assumes that the organization seeks to reshape migration governance in an intentional and proactive manner. And this nuances previous research on IOM. Many studies see the IOM as a passive instrument used by donor states to implement border control measures and to fight against irregular migration. This interpretation is rooted in the fact that IOM has been created as a functional international organization, meaning that it was created to provide services in agreement and at the request of states. So the states decide what IOM has to do and has to offer in terms of services. In contrast to the UNHCR, which safeguards the application of the Refugee Convention, IOM does not have the authority to tell the states how to conduct their migration policies. So this weakness is compounded by the fact that almost all funding of IOM, all funding to IOM country offices is allocated by donor states to specific and time-limited projects that most align with their interests. So this limits the ability of the IOM administration located in Geneva to determine the priorities of the IOM country offices. And that is why researchers tend to overlook the documents and meetings of IOM in Geneva, which the book considers and which the book argues are important to understand how IOM transformed since the 2000s. So the book recognized the limitations of the authority and autonomy of IOM. One way it does this is by using a cultural political economy approach, which considers how a new imaginary has to confront existing discourses, interests, bureaucratic practices, and organizational structures to become taken for granted. If an imaginary does not change these elements, it faces the possibility of remaining as a mere discursive interpretation, among others, that fails to materially change reality. And by failing to change reality, it risks becoming contested and discarded. So consequently, the book is careful to examine the documents and meetings of IOM in Geneva in a way that highlighted the successes, but also the failures of IOM in translating migration management into a policy and organizational frameworks that are capable of effectively transforming the migration policies of states and the policies of IOM country offices. In fact, the book is critical of IOM, but it is not so much critical of the ways in which IOM is used more or less willingly by donor states to implement border control measures. The book is critical of the technocratic form of governance promoted by and implemented by IOM in migration management. IOM favors depoliticized policy coordination and the implementation of technical solutions to rationalize the discourses, ways of acting, interacting, and ways of being of social, of governments, international organizations, NGOs, think tanks, and migrants. Moreover, IOM assumes that once the appropriate technical tools are devised, migration can be rendered intelligible and predictable, and that social actors can be convinced or at least disciplined to act rationally. So this is illustrated by the enthusiastic belief of IOM that digital technologies and data can fill knowledge gaps on migration, that they can help monitor the movements of migrants, that they can help empower migrants to make the right choices to migrate and when to migrate, and that digital technologies can help to evaluate policies of states in an objective manner that cannot be contested. So against this backdrop, the book highlights the failures of IOM to account for the complexity of migration, for unexpected crises, for the limitations of technical solutions, and for the political character of migration governance. So to conclude, I would like to quickly go over the structure of the book. The book is organized in 3 parts, and each part is composed of 2 chapters. So the first part examines how migration management emerged within IOM. The first chapter analyzes how IOM formulated migration management starting from 2002 to emphasize the ineffectiveness of securitization in a context of globalization, and also to criticize states for their restrictive migration policies following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The second chapter examined how the member states recognized the relevance of migration management while attempting to reaffirm their control over IOM. The chapter also discusses how the 2008 Great Recession, which was a serious crisis of globalization, how it undermined migration management and led to its transformation. From this point on, migration management stopped talking about economic structures and focused instead on the rational and resilient individual as the driver of migration. And from this point on, IOM considered that its role consists in putting a stop to barriers that enable migrants to act rationally. And these barriers can be state policies or humanitarian crises. The second part of the book analyzes how migration management has been translated into new policy initiatives and organizational strategies that aim to transform both migration governance and IOM. The third chapter examines the migration governance framework, which IOM designed in 2015 to regulate how states exercise their sovereignty and how states interact with IOM. The fourth chapter studies the migration crisis operational framework, which IOM designed in 2012 to systematize and centralize its interventions in crisis situations. And the chapter examines how IOM understands crises, and it understands crisis as a set of a sequence of events that can be predicted, which is quite interesting to examine. The third part of the book studies how migration management has been materially constructed by governmental technologies. And governmental technologies are mechanisms and instruments through which governing is effectively accomplished. The fifth chapter examines how IOM leveraged the expertise of a number of Silicon Valley corporations to design governmental technologies aimed at monitoring the policies of states and the movements of migrants in the global south. And the last chapter examines how IOM tried to build an international consensus favorable to migration management, to enshrine migration management by joining the UN in 2016 and by trying to shape the negotiations of the Global Compact in 2017 and 2018. Finally, the conclusion discusses the transformation of IOM between the 2000s and 2018 as a result of migration management, but also it discusses some of the failures of IOM which could weaken migration management in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Younès. Go on.
My turn. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for having given me the opportunity to read and comment on your book. I learned a lot, even though I thought I knew 3 or 4 things about IOM. Actually, it's for me, I really learned a lot. And I must say that I have a much more sympathetic view on IOM, even if it's a critical book about the activities of IOM. Now I got a much more, maybe more positive view about IOM than I used to. I was pretty much influenced by what you said at the very beginning, by the literature on IOM, which was extremely critical. And I tended to think that the liberal discourses and activities of IOM was just a wrap around a much more security-oriented agenda, and which drives the activities of IOM on the ground. But actually, this liberal side of IOM is much more than a wrap. It's really part of the DNA of IOM. And also now I understand much better I knew that it was a very schizophrenic institution, but now I know why. And I would say that this schizophrenia has 3 layers. It has first an epistemological layer. It is an institution that you said it was created in the 50s, but actually it was recreated and propelled at the forefront of the scene in the 90s. I will go back to it. It's important. It's very important. But what is the 90s? It was created in the after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, after in a world where which was carrying the promise of a very positive globalization, and a neoliberal one, of course, with the free markets, with the possibility also for the migrants to find a space in this globalization. And it was also, from an epistemological point of view, the success of theories on globalization, such as transnationalism, such as also you had the book of Fukuyama, The End of History. You had Manuel Castells and the idea of a global village. So the idea that of the possibility also of a networked world which would end up which would fuel the demise of the nation states. The end of the nation state as the key political unit in the spirit, a very tension spirit, the progress of the world, which is propelled or geared towards the reconstruction of a global humanity. So that was the 90s, and I insist on this context because it's still traverse and guides the activities and the way of thinking of IOM. And I suppose that people like Bimal Ghosh and Khalid Koser as well has been key in this kind of support, has been very supportive of this kind of approach. So, but its tension and schizophrenia comes from the fact that now we are not in the same world anymore. it's a post-2001 world, which is characterized by the coming back of the borders and of the crisis. So it's truly opposite. It was created in a world of globalization and expansion, and now it's more the border and the crisis that characterize our Commonwealth. So it has to adapt to a new world, and it has really difficulties to do so. The second layer of the schizophrenia is the one of, I would call it's the governmentality. I use the Foucauldian concept. So the spirit of government. And Foucault says that there are two forms of governmentalities. You get, well, in his work, the socialist governmentality, which is about, well, he thinks about the USSR and the socialist governmentality, according to Foucault, is a way of addressing social phenomena with the intent to shape it and to shape to give a shape to social dynamics that which aligns with a national agenda. So such as, okay, the China wants to have a low demography, it forbids women to have more than one child. So that's shaping a social phenomenon. Whereas, as opposed to a liberal governmentality for Foucault, which is not so much as shaping these social phenomena, but driving them. Combining understanding the mechanics of the social phenomenon to drive them in the direction that suits to a national agenda. So with a minimal adjustment. So, and here we got a tension between both within IOM. Within, on the one hand, the desire to set up and implement these technologies of trying to understand as precisely as possible migration flows in order to adjust them. But at the same time, it is also driven by the will also to shape, it's also a state-based agenda to shape the migration flows and to filter what kind of migration they want, and to encourage high-skill migration, to discourage unskilled migration, and this type of the other forms of shaping the social dynamics of migration flows. So that's the second layer, governmentality, and the third layer is the one of governance, the schizophrenia of governance. As you mentioned, it was created in the 50s by the US as a counterweight to HCR and ILO, but it was exactly repropelled at the forefront of the international scene during the first Kuwait War and the first Iraqi War for the same reasons, as far as I know. It was pushed by the US for the management of the movement of population during the Iraq War, as opposed to the HCR. So it is part of a realist agenda of some states. But at the same time, and also it's an intergovernmental institution, which is there to serve the interest of the states, the member states. Okay, so, and that's why they are so keen on having a project-based organization. So that's the first thing. But at the same time, you get the administration with its global agenda. So, which has a completely different form of agenda. And the third layer, so you got the states, you got the administration at the global level, and you got the offices at the national level. And they all have also their own agenda. And it's a bit like the EU actually, yeah, with the Commission, with the Council, and with the member states. So there is a tension
Only
between
there's no IOM citizenship.
yeah. And IOM is not citizenship, but there is a similar tension in the governance system of the IOM, and you can see that at each step of its development, there is a struggle between the administration, with the states, with the UN, with the offices, and so the shaping of the administration is kind of dialectic, a dynamic between the different interests that compose the IOM or surround the IOM. Okay. So now I understand better the different dimensions of the IOM schizophrenia. There are nevertheless two ways in which IOM tries to leverage its legitimacy. So the first one is that it's why I think it's so powerful, is that it fills a void, definitely. It fills a void of the governance of migration. And there is no equivalence, and there is a real need, and migration is a key social phenomenon of our world, and it must be governed or managed in the world of in the terms of IOM, and it has the capacity to do so because it has this range of offices, it has a budget, it has a merit to exist where there is no other equivalent. So that's the first thing. But the second way it tries to leverage its legitimacy is through the knowledge that it tries to produce. It tries to sell itself as the producer of the legitimate knowledge about migration, as compared with the one which is produced by the other international organizations. And you see that there is a tension who's trying to impose who is in charge of the production of the data, who is in charge of the management of the data, the GenDAC, and so on and so forth. But also probably with the researchers themselves. There is also a tension here. All right, so knowledge and capacity of actions, I think, are the two ways it tries to leverage its legitimacy. Okay, so now we see why it is a kind of very ambivalent organizations, a very half-finished organization as well. It's half a UN organization, half not. It's still project-based, doesn't fully acknowledge the agenda of the UN. But at the same time, it's always there. During the Global Compact, okay, even the name of the Global Compact, safe, orderly, and which one?
Regular.
And regular migration comes from the IOM. I mean, it's part of the agenda. But at the same time, it has been rejected during the process, and it's coming back through the window, and so on and so on. So it's at the same time very strong and very fragile. And which I think this tension is also explains why its propensity to jump on any opportunity to earn any emerging issue. And I'm thinking of, for example, the agenda on the cities. This question of the cities that emerged during the Global Compact is jumping on it. And also the question of the death at the border. It was raised by the NGOs, and then they create immediately an organization to deal with it. So he needs to fill a void because he can't afford of losing ground, because it's fragile, because of its fragility. So we can also understand the way they function. Okay. So to finish, I got just one couple of minutes on the limit of your work. I think that's okay because of you didn't talk so much about your methodology, but you focused on the text and the production, the text of the production of the administration. And of course, when you focus on the text, you lose part of the context, and you don't spend too much. And so. We sometimes we feel that we need to understand more what's behind the scene, what's behind the text. And for example, with the formulation of the agenda on the crisis, we would like to know more about what kind of crisis we're talking about. is it the Libyan crisis of 2011? So at some point you mentioned it in passing, but it would be interesting to know a bit more about that. I think the context is important in that regard. And also because of you like the context, maybe there is sometimes a problem of interpretation, and you give too much force and too much presence to the IOM. And for example, when you say that IOM has developed these technological tools of knowledge as tools to weaken the state, both vertically and horizontally. Remember, and I think that's well, it's not the IOM who's doing that. I mean, even beyond the IOM, there is already a dynamic of transformation of the states because of the development of these neo-managerial techniques of governments, the development of the governance forms of managing public affairs. The states are transforming, and so the IOM is just moving along this dynamics which already exist beyond the IOM. And so it's also part and parcel of the rise of what I would call the transnational state. The state transforms itself and transnationalize itself through the management of migration beyond the agenda of the IOM itself. So it's just here feeding into a process that already exists. And the same with the humanitarian aspects. You say, okay, they try to occupy the humanitarian sphere, but the humanitarian sphere is already there since the very beginning, actually, because of the development of the camps and the technique of the encampment. The humanitarian is also nested within the techniques of the humanitarian camps, even before the IOM took charge of it. It was already there for the creation of the Melia camp in the early 2000s, and so on and so forth. And also the humanitarian aspect has been also part and parcel of the management of undocumented workers as well in the settlement countries. So it was already there. So that's it for me. I got two questions, and you told me to present partly in French, so I'm going to. Je vais présenter mes questions en français. It's a bilingual meeting. Alors, la première question, en fait, tu as beaucoup parlé de la relation entre IOM et les États et les Nations Unies. Par contre, tu n'as pas beaucoup parlé des relations qu'ils pouvaient maintenir avec les ONG et la société civile, notamment dans sa dynamique d'expansion et d'occupation du terrain de l'humanitaire. Quelle a été la réaction des ONG dans cette perspective-là? Et la deuxième question que j'ai à te poser, c'est tu parsèmes ton texte de ces portraits qui sont fantastiques, peut-être un peu trop court de temps en temps parce qu'on reste un peu sur sa fin, mais ces portraits, tu dépasses, ils sont importants parce que tu dépasses une analyse purement néo-institutionnelle et fondée sur les institutions, et tu montres par là que les individus ont un rôle aussi. Mais j'aimerais bien savoir, selon toi, qu'est-ce qui fait le lien entre ces portraits? Est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose qui se dégage? Est-ce qu'il y a une personnalité dans ces différents portraits qui a une espèce de portrait robot de la personne, de ces acteurs qui interviennent dans les gestions de l'OIM? Voilà mes deux questions. Merci beaucoup, Younès.
Merci, tous les deux, and thank you. Actually, in the interest of time, I would like to open the floor directly for some further questions, and Younès, maybe you can address both. Emma, est-ce qu'on a des questions?
Pas pour l'instant, not for the time being, but it's fine.
It's okay. Also, our online participants might need some time to get together their thoughts. So I know several people here have worked on global governance. So yeah, Rita.
Hi, Younès. Thank you very much for your very interesting book. I wanted to ask you, so in this migration governance regime,
because there is no regime, it's a regime complex, where you see IOM. I was interested to see that in the last decade or so, it's really become quite prominent, right, in the whole governance of migration and with its role in the global compact, but also becoming a UN, what is it called, related organization, which is interesting in itself that it's become that, not quite a UN agency, but also this issue related to trust and legitimacy of this organization in comparison to the UNHCR, the ILO, right? Because it's project-based and funded by the, donor states, but which is mostly, I guess, the northern states. With the leadership is always the US, right?
Yeah, with one exception, there was a European general.
Maybe you complete the question and then.
Yeah, so basically why it has advanced so much in the last decade, trying to come within the UN kind of structure a little bit.
So I have Bridget and Ian.
Thank you so much, Younès. Yeah, very much looking forward to reading the book. I was just wondering if you could expand on 2 points that you made regarding state sovereignty and the role of the IOM. So, yeah, you just raised the point about like it being because of the function of the IOM, it being maybe a passive instrument at times of the donor states. Then also you mentioned that it it's not necessarily concerned with the idea of like state sovereignty or fulfilling the legal obligations of state sovereignty. But to me, yeah, I just wondering if you can expand on that, because to me, if it is a passive instrument of donor states, perhaps there is an expansion of state sovereignty happening there beyond their borders. So I'm wondering if in your research, you made any additional arguments for that dynamic.
Thank you.
I have a methodological question. I didn't get, did you interview people from the unknown? And how accessible were they as privileged informers? Because, and I had some, and I had a lot of experience. I had some experience in European policymakers. They were not very easy people to deal with. So how difficult was it in terms of access to privileged informers if there were one such? If not, you still had access to the documents, also privileged narratives. How open was this access to you as researcher? How did you negotiate it? Did they ask for any accountability, like any interim accounts? And did they express any interest in somehow having access to the findings? That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, thank you. Emma, are there questions in the chat?
So there's one question being typed at the moment.
Okay, then I can ask my question while the question is being typed and, Jeremy, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, so, yeah, I wanted to ask about the role of the states that are not of the global north, but are still relatively migration receiving states. So I wanted to, like, for example, I would think like broad countries, Malaysia, or, I was wondering if, like, how do they use the IOM? Because you say that there's an instrumentation of IOM by the states, the states are kind of defining the agenda of the local office. So I wanted to know if you would say that there is a differential approach to the instrumentation of the IOM by these kinds of states. And so kind of the broader question is, would you say that there is a kind of decentering of the global governance like migration coming from these states, or do they follow similar frames or ideas as traditional?
Okay, so one participant, Margaret, has a question about the role of NGOs and civil society in this context, especially maybe in the context of Brazil, if you've ever looked into that. And there's another question by Nayan. And the question is, how effectively can the IOM operate and achieve its goals in the humanitarian sphere, especially given the fact that much of its activities indirectly revolve around the agendas of donor states? And there's another question
if by the same participant, if the IOM can really promote equitable migration governance, if there are donor states, if it is not part of the agenda of donor states.
Is Younès supposed to decide on? Yeah, I have also just a small question that I think ties in with the questions by Thomas, and I confess, and I have to tell everyone, you shouldn't feel guilty if you haven't read the book, because the book was just out, really. Looking forward myself to reading it. I've read a lot of other work that Younès has written, and so it's a question that maybe we don't have an answer, but kind of also relates to the methodological questions. So you speak about how the IOM has evolved, and I believe you speak in the book, and I think, Thomas, you were asking also how IOM has evolved in relation to these broader transformations or these three schizophrenias in migration and asylum governance. And I was wondering what has been the role of people versus, I don't know, institutional factors in the evolution of IOM. Yeah, I've never met Bimal Ghosh. I've emailed with him, and I believe you might have met him in Geneva, and he was an iconic figure in earlier years. And I was wondering, for instance, did Bimal have a really pivotal role in creating that program? And then what do we learn about the role of people versus institutional structures? And you have like 10 minutes to answer all that. But I think we've been all very good with time.
Yeah, maybe I can start with your last question. So what was the role of people in comparison with the institutions? I found that the role of people is important during crises. For instance, when migration management faced a crisis of how, when migration management seemed to be inadequate in interpreting migration during the 2008 Great Recession, here the role of people was really important to stabilize the discourse of migration management, to offer a explanation of what was happening. And here expertise plays a real important role. Academics play an important role during this. Okay. Oh, I thought it was an alarm fire.
Yeah, we do have fire alarm.
Yeah, so during crisis, people with a recognized expertise play an important role. And Bimal Ghosh is quite interesting because he's an academic and international migration expert, but also he has he participated in the Commission on the Global Governance, which is a policy in terms of policy making, an important forum. So he combines the expertise, the political authority, let's say, and this gives him the ability to create a new way of understanding migration. And then with his connections with IOM, he was also a policy advisor to the IOM. He found an institution that could implement his discourses. Research question regarding the expansion of the IOM in relation with the UN. IOM became a related organization and not a specialized organization or a full member of the UN system because of the resistance of donor states. So the IOM administration was looking to join the UN as a full member to be able to participate in the decision-making bodies within the UN in order not to be left out. But when it joined the UN as a related organization, it joined it with the understanding at some point it will become a specialized organization like the World Health Organization or other organizations similar. So your question on the sovereignty. So as Thomas said, it's a organization that has schizophrenia. So sometimes it acts as a passive instrument to donor states, but some other times, especially when there's a crisis, IOM feels confident to argue and demand more authority and to criticize states. I think the book is quite interesting, but because it shows that crises, whether humanitarian, economic, or else, crises really are important moments where the IOM can ask for and use more authority. Yes. So in terms of methodology, so I wasn't able to conduct interviews with IOM staff. I was, to compensate, I was able to adopt a method of participant observation. I was an intern in a diplomatic mission in Geneva, and as such, I was able to attend meetings and to have access to documents. I must be frank, at the University of Geneva, questions about ethics weren't that important. So I didn't ask permission to use the documents or discussed my research with IOM staff, to be blunt.
But there was no one identified in any way. I mean,
No,
it wasn't, it was a question of understanding what was happening, but like say, Thomas was interviewed or shadowed, and then you spoke about Thomas, say.
No.
It remained at the institutional level.
It remained at the institutional level. And the problem is that as an intern, I had access to IOM meetings, but I didn't have access to informal interactions between the IOM staff and diplomats. So I know there's some context that's missing. It's something I discuss in the book. But the important point is that I have had access to important documents that help to understand how IOM interacts with member states, with diplomats. The questions. Yes, your question regarding what is the link between the different portraits of people that were important in the evolution of migration management. I mean, the portrait robot, as you said, is people like us, is people with a PhD that have been in the best universities in North America, basically, and which have been had responsibilities within governments, had responsibilities in parts of governments that were quite parts of governments like ministries of interiors that are more that have a tendency to focus on irregular migration. But these people, when they move to the IOM, they focus on the global aspect of migration governance, and they abandoned the focus of states on protecting borders. And some comments I have on what you said. IOM is very much influenced by a utopian view of globalization that originated in the 90s. And it's quite funny to see how IOM staff keep believing in this utopian idea of globalization, even though, as you said, the world has changed. State sovereignty has been reaffirmed. So in the book, you can see that a lot of times IOM staff were shocked. They couldn't understand why the resurgence of nationalism, populism. For instance, when Donald Trump enacted the Muslim ban, this was a shock to IOM staff members. It is something. It exemplifies how states can put an end to globalization by erecting barriers suddenly, with creating chaos in airports and so on. So these are kind of events that migration management, IOM staff are unable to understand, which is quite strange, really. I think I'll end it here.